welcome to the Torah and Science debate. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Godfryd. Very well written, very well spoken. He's been here once before, for sure once before, and I know very, very well received. So it's always a pleasure and something to look forward to. I remember Aryeh when he still used to be in the public schools and debating with or involving the high school students. And of course, these are typical issues that many of us grapple with. The conflict between science and Torah. And there was, I think it's still ongoing, a yearly symposium. It used to be out of Florida, of doctors and scientists that would get together for this purpose. They would put out a publication of all the different articles, and for a long time I know you were part of it, maybe you still are. So really it's a great pleasure, and without further ado, Dr. Godfryd.
Thank you, Rabbi Bernstein. I was presented with a topic, the Torah and Science debate. It's something that I was grappling with 30 years ago, just over 30 years ago. I don't know if anybody was here the last time I spoke, but yeah, you were. I guess I chased them all away. So I'll take the liberty to explain that I really looked very much like I do today, except the hair distribution was like the other way around. It was long on top and short on the bottom. It was my first day in graduate school, and a Gentile microbiologist comes over from across the hall and says to me, "I can prove to you," he says to me something that I had never heard before, because I had never before met a Lubavitcher. This guy was a Gentile microbiologist, but he told me something, he asked me something that only Lubavitchers have asked from so many different Jews: "Are you Jewish?" He asked me, "Am I Jewish?" I said, "Yeah, why?" He said, "So I can prove to you that your Torah is of divine origin." I mean, here I was with, hair down to my toches and in a ponytail, with in the university graduate school uniform, shredded blue jeans, a plaid shirt, and I guess he just saw the nose and figured he'd have some fun. I was so not interested in debating the divine origin of the Torah, but he was like twice my age and twice my size. I figured I'd better say, "Oh really, how would that be?" So he told me, Moses put a falsifiable zoological hypothesis in the Torah. He didn't really have to do that. I mean, he split the sea, he brought the Jews out of Egypt. Why would there be such an obvious thing that could be shown wrong, and yet we see it's right? In the Torah it says there are 4 types of animals that have only one of 2 kosher signs. 2 kosher signs being
chewing its cud
and split hooves. And you only have the camel, the rock badger, the pig, and the hare, which are clearly types which have only one of those 2 kosher signs. He says there's a tradition that is the list. And we've been looking around for thousands of years. How many species of mammals could Moses have known living in the Middle East?
Yeah.
Maybe he traveled around a little bit. 50, 100, 200. If he was well-traveled, we know close to 10,000 today. And we still haven't, there have been some, maybe this animal, maybe that animal, but basically the story hasn't changed. Why would he put that in? He couldn't have known. My response to that was, when is this guy going to go away? I didn't care at all. It left me cold. That debate was irrelevant to me. Later, when a Lubavitch rabbi started talking about love, dating, and relationships, that was something a graduate school student could be interested in, but rather than accept that at face value, that's when I got into the Torah and Science debate. No, it can't be right. And actually something similar happened when I was teaching a course called Faith and Science at New College. I taught this course for 7 years. I brought the course pack here. 400 pages the kids needed to study and know. So one of the lectures in that course, in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences there, a third-year undergraduate course, packed lecture hall, 100 kids there, and one of the lectures was alternative concepts of species origin. I wanted to call it debunking Darwin, but I was advised that it really wouldn't fly. So we called it alternative concepts of species origin. The lecture was designed so that you'd have to basically be an ostrich, somewhere between an ostrich and a bonehead, to accept the Darwinian view after a 45-minute lecture, because I really loaded it up with facts, arguments, statistics, and peer-reviewed science, basically pulling the rug out from under the notion that the diversity of life today is a result of random mutation and natural selection. That was my purpose. I wasn't out to prove that the Bible is true. I was out to demonstrate that Darwinian evolution is neither fact nor necessarily scientific theory. After 45 minutes of presenting this presentation, which was substantiated in the material that they had to read as well, I asked if there were any questions. The first question was a debate question. It was definitely a hardened position. A student, looked pretty Jewish to me, says, "Are you going to take this line down? What's the matter? Nobody's saying anything? Look at this guy. He's wearing a skull cap. He's got this big beard. Obviously, he's an Orthodox Jew. Did you ever hear anybody else talk like that? Obviously, he's got an agenda. Why wouldn't you hear another scientist talk like that? And you're just going to tape this? This is a university. This is not a synagogue." He's ranting. I'm not able to even open my mouth. I'm just waiting for him to take a breath. And 4 students sort of gang up on him. They looked like a little United Nations right there, because they all, in their own cultural context, saying, "What's the matter? Are the arguments false? The literature he quoted isn't valid. The statistics were inaccurate. Why are you going into a polemic? If you've got some counter-argument, raise it. But getting so excited and not saying anything, what's the matter with you?" So I thought, wow, they did my work for me. That was amazing. So I come over to him and I say, "I'm very interested in what you have to say. I've got an office hour next week before the lecture. Why don't you come in? By the way, what's your name?" Oh, I remember that nice Jewish name from the list. He comes in, and of course I'm ready. I got my tefillin. I ask him, when he comes in for the office hour, I ask him, "So, make a little conversation. Where are you from?" "I'm from Toronto." "Really? Where did you go to school?" "Hebrew Academy." "Where are you?" I said, "Oh, so you're Jewish?" He says, "Yeah, of course I'm Jewish." I say, "Great. I happen to have some tefillin. Do you know what tefillin are?" He says, "Do I know what tefillin are?" "You want me to put on tefillin now?" I said, "Just takes a minute." He said, "All right, let's get it over with." So I take out the tefillin, I help him on with it, and I tell him, "Baruch." He goes, "Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'tzvos b'tzvos on your tefillin." Putting on the tefillin, quickly getting him the other tefillin, he puts it all on. So I say to him, "Okay, so now we're going to say Shema." He says, "Oh, okay, I'll say Shema." So he says, "Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem echad v'ahavta v'hayim Shema." He's going through the whole thing. I rushed to get him a siddur. He says, "I'm not going to daven a whole shachris. I'm not going to pray the whole morning service." I said, "I wasn't suggesting." Anyway, as he's taking off the tefillin, I'm asking him questions. He says, I said, "So you went to chat? Do you live at home?" He said, "No, I live downtown." I said, "In residence?" He says, "No, in an apartment." I said, "You're on your own, or are you sharing?" He said, "I'm sharing." He said, "With a bunch of guys?" He goes, "No, just with one person. A boy or a girl?" "A girl." "Is she Jewish?" "No." At that point, I understood why he was debating Darwin. The big Torah science debate was, he wasn't arguing for the truth of the scientific theory and so on. He was arguing for his liberty. He was arguing because if Darwin is wrong, then maybe the girl is wrong. But if Darwin is right, maybe it doesn't matter about the girl. I had a choice. I could have sort of like pursued it another step, but I thought, you know what? Let's let that one go. I don't know what happened to this young man, but we're talking about the Torah and science debate, and the debates aren't always true debates where there's a true conflict. Let me give another example. There's a rabbi sitting on a plane. Beside him is a nice gentleman, nice fellow. He says, "Excuse me, sir, are you a rabbi?" He says, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I am." He says, "Really? You know, I'm Jewish too, and I'll tell you something. I know all about Judaism." He says, "Really? What do you know about Judaism?" He says, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." He says, "Great, I see you've been studying. Basic concept. Tell me, what do you do?" He says, "I'm an astrophysicist." He says, "Oh, fantastic. Rabbi goes, "I know all about astronomy." He says, "Oh, come on, Rabbi, what could you know about astronomy? I studied for 20 years. I mean, it's a huge field. It's very complex." He says, "No, trust me, I know." He says, "What do you know about astronomy?" "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." So, we got one truism, we have another truism. Is it wrong after the whole thing is over and done with? I mean, I studied astrophysics. Why? Because of the twinkle, twinkle, little star. It's beautiful, the greatness of space and the amazing things that you can find, you know. And as the telescopes get better and better, you find more and more. But maybe just like astrophysics doesn't come down to twinkle, twinkle, little star, and Judaism doesn't come down to love your neighbor as yourself, although that is a big fundamental concept. When it comes to the details, maybe we just don't understand where there's a true conflict, where there's a contrast, where there's complementarity, where there's convergence, and where there's even confluence where they're actually saying the same thing. You got to look a little deeper. So, who's really doing the debating these days? I really wonder. It's a topic that I don't know if I would have come up with. I don't find too much going on in the news. Also, when you look a little deeper, they say, and there's some truth to this, for the believer, no proof is necessary. And for the skeptic, no proof is sufficient. So are they really arguing from a perspective? Can there be an exchange of ideas where one will change position? What is the exchange of ideas about? So you can say, well, there are some real bones of contention. The age of the universe, for example. Either you say the world is 5,775 years old, and a wonderful 6 days before that, or you say that the universe is 13.7 billion years old. There's no way to reconcile these two. Either it's this or it's that. Well, there are a lot of different books out and lecturers who talked about stretchy time and different things like that. I'll give one example, Moshe Carmeli. Moshe Carmeli is on the selection committee for Nobel physicists. If you want to get a Nobel Prize in physics, it's got to go past Reb Moshe. If he doesn't like it, chances are you ain't getting it. Moshe Carmeli wrote a beautiful little article in Astrophysica, one of these astrophysics journals, a primary astrophysics journal, demonstrating that the 13.7 billion years that the universe appears to be old is actually a cosmological constant from the first cosmological day. In other words, the universe was created with a perceived age 13.7 billion years ago. In its first moments, it was already 13.7 billion years old. It was accepted by peer review, published in an astrophysics journal. It's there for anybody. So do we have a debate about the age of the universe? Okay, the universe is that old. Did those years transpire, and in what way? It leaves room for a young world that actually had some days followed by our years. You could pick and choose. Now you could say, wait a minute, we've got a redshift, we've got a cosmological redshift, the Hubble redshift, the raisin cake theory of the universe. I don't know who actually learned these concepts in school, but we're talking about something that goes back about 60 years, this general idea. And the Big Bang is the theory that explains the redshift, and if you don't have a Big Bang, you have no explanation, and that's what we were taught. I was taught that 45 years ago. That was a fact for me 40 and 30 and 30 years ago. But less than 10 years ago, there was a cosmological conference in Curaçao off the coast of Portugal, where 30 cosmologists, top-notch people, got together to protest the stranglehold that the Big Bang theory has on cosmology today. And they published a sort of like a petition to the research councils around the world that they should allow alternative concepts because the Big Bang theory has more problems than it answers. There are many reasons why it is not to be trusted. And this is not for me. I'm not a cosmologist. It was published in Physics Letters B. We're talking about a really solid physics journal. Another 300 scientists signed that petition. The New Scientist magazine had a headline, "Is the Big Bang bust?" But here we are. Cosmology is still going on. There were other issues with it. So if we're debating, we're saying, Torah, nah, science knows. Well, science, yes, but does science know? What does science know? And is it really in conflict? These are the questions we need to ask. We can say, okay, well, we won't debate that. Let's debate geocentrism. Obviously, the sun doesn't go around the earth goes around the sun. Well, came relativity. First came Galileo's relativity, Newton's relative views, and then Einstein's relativity. But the point is, you can choose your point of reference. Any inertial reference frame can be the center of motion. You don't have a sun at the center. You don't have an earth at the center. You have an arbitrary choice of where your center of motion will be. And all motion is relative. Just like time is relative, space is relative, therefore motion is relative. And the whole statement is poorly founded. It's a throwback to Copernicus to say you believe in a heliocentric or sun-centered universe. Science is not there anymore. So if you talk to top-notch relativity physicists, even Einstein's student, Hans Reichenbach, he wrote a whole chapter on it, on the philosophy of space and time, demonstrating that if you want the Earth to be the center and everything to go around it, including the stars, he just goes one by one through the problems that you may have with that and answers them all. It's an unrefuted article. It's there if you want to look at it. But people will say, no, it can't be. It's obvious, it's plain. But it's because you get a picture of how things are. You get attached to that story. It's a narrative. So an alternative narrative, sometimes it's hard to adopt an alternative narrative. Anybody here married? Ever got into an argument with your spouse? Sometimes it's hard to understand the alternative narrative of what really happened because you've got your own view of what really happened. So then, evolution. So just I mentioned it before, we'll just mention a couple of things. That those that are feeling that, no, Darwinism, it's been around for 150 years, it's really solid. Well, we have to take into account what the experts are saying. A fellow by the name of Ilya Prigogine has 2 Nobel Prizes in chemistry on self-organizing systems. Now, who do you think would be a bigger advocate for random origin and evolution of life than a guy with 2 Nobel Prizes on self-organizing systems. He writes clearly that the probability of the chemical reactions that characterize life, the probability that those reactions came about by chance, is 0. 0. He doesn't assign it some arbitrarily small probability. Kann nicht sein. Can't be. Übrigens, Hoyle, Dobzhansky, Mayer, we're talking about big players in science and big players in evolution. They're very clear the Darwinian model does not work. I remember when Stephen Jay Gould came to the University of Toronto and he spoke to a packed audience and he talked about a thing called punctuated equilibrium. What is this punctuated equilibrium? That species stay the same for millions of years, and then all of a sudden, poof, they change, but not through a natural selection model. They suddenly change. They don't change in the fossil record. They appear suddenly. They don't change. They disappear suddenly. New species pop in. What's the model? He said, I remember this clearly, in 1977. There is no model. Science will never have a model. There cannot be data that will explain that because it just is a sudden and not gradual phenomenon. You can't explain sudden changes like that with a gradualist model. It does not work. Well, people had no trouble because he was Stephen Jay Gould. But evolutionary biology plods along because there's no alternative concept. What are you going to take? God created the world in 6 days and the 7th day he rested. They didn't want that. So they go along with the emperor, regardless of the new clothes and no new clothes. Anybody get the Wall Street Journal? About, I also don't get it, but somebody forwarded to me an article just from a couple of months ago. Science increasingly makes the case for God. This is not something that I made up. There's a whole trend going on right now. Here's what happened. They talk about a different type of evolution, the evolution of science. 1966, the SETI program was launched, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Some of you have, like me, more salt than pepper in their beards. You might remember. And Carl Sagan, you know, the great space scientist, he says, you know what, you really only need 2 factors to have a planet that could support life. A G-type star, like the sun, which a certain percentage of stars are like the sun, and a rock whipping around at a reasonable distance in order to support life. If you've got those 2 factors, you've got it. So they start looking and they can't find, and they start looking and they can't find. Meanwhile, our understanding of life improves. So then we realize there are not 2 factors you need for life to evolve. There are 10. So now the number of potential planets goes from 10 to the 27th, down to 10 to the 24th, and 10 to the 20th. And by today, there are 200 factors, each of which are absolutely essential for life to exist. Otherwise, it cannot exist. And all of them are shrinking down that probability until that probability, too, has come, as Wall Street Journal points out, with big names behind it, saying probability is 0. Including here, on the Earth where we are. There is no probability that we could exist. We are not an improbability. We are a statistical impossibility, but here we are to talk about it. How did that come about? Well, so the ground is softening, and science is softening. It's not as materialistic as it was. So, for me, the real story isn't about the Torah and science debate. The real story is about Torah and science synergy. Faith and science synergy in general, and Torah and science synergy in particular. Now, this synergy happens because, obviously, one God made them both. God made nature in such a way that we could understand it. God gave us a Torah in such a way that we can understand it to some degree, but we do understand it's the template or the blueprint for creation. So it only makes sense that the blueprint and the building aren't really, in essence, in conflict. And it's another story that I'd like to share from the university days when I taught this course. A very interesting experiment. I'll tell you how the experiment came to be, and then I'll tell you where the experiment came from. 100 kids in the class. I asked for a couple of volunteers. I told them what to do. I said, I'm going to ask 2 questions. You take a look at this half of the class, and you take a look at that half of the class. Your job is to find out if most of the people, when I ask question 1, are head up or head down when they try to figure out the answer. And you do the same on this side of the class, both for question 1 and question 2. What was question 1? Question 1 was a memory question. Question 2 was a concentration question. The memory question, the class was on Friday. Question 1 was, what did you have for lunch on Tuesday, and with whom did you have lunch? So I gave them a little bit of time to think about that. Okay, put up your hand when you just briefly when you've got your answer, blah blah. The second question was, I don't remember exactly the numbers. Something like, what is 17 times 11? You're not allowed to use a pen. Something like that. I might have made it easier. 17 times.
187.
Huh?
187.
187. Very good. 17 times 11. So, again, I told them, when you've got it, put up your hand. And then I asked them, I disclosed what it is that they were supposed to note. And I asked them to report to the class. What did they find? The memory question, both observers looking at each half of the class, found that most people with the memory question were looking up. They were more often looking up than looking down. And with the concentration question, they were more often looking down than looking up. They're trying to calculate this. So then I told them a story. Rabbi Bernstein, you know the story I told them? We read the same Sikha of the Rebbe. The Rebbe writes in Likutei Sichos a story that happened with the previous Rebbe's father about 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, I think. Yeah, around 100 years ago. He was at a meal, and somebody came in and said, you know what they discovered in medicine? An amazing thing, that there's a blood vessel at the back of the brain, and depending on the vapor pressure in this blood vessel, it shifts position. In one position it stimulates memory, and another position it stimulates concentration. The Rebbe didn't comment at the time, but after the meal was over, he slipped out for a moment, pulled a slender volume out of the Schneerson library, written by his great-great-grandfather, right? The Mittler Rebbe was his Rebbe Sham's great-great-grandfather. Something like that. 2 to 5. Maybe great-grandfather. 100 years before that, or so. And then he opens it up and he starts to read that it's in the brain there's a blood vessel that, depending on its position, one position it moves, and depending on its position, one position stimulates memory, and another position stimulates concentration. And the proof of this vessel's action is that when one wants to concentrate, one tends to lower one's head, and when one wants to remember, one tends to raise one's head. This way facilitating blood flow to the appropriate area of the brain. So the guest at the table said, that's astounding. The Rebbe must have been a tremendous physiologist. They just discovered this in physiology. He said, that's ridiculous. The Rebbe's not a physiologist, wasn't a physiologist. He didn't dissect cadavers. He didn't go to medical school. He said, well, how could he have known it? He said, because there's a spiritual template of man. Kabbalah, it talks about Adam Kadmon, the primordial man, not the first man that was physically in the world, but the schema, the template from which physical man is derived. And because this blood vessel exists in the spiritual man, that's why it exists in the physical man. He knows about the blood vessel from the spiritual realms. The doctors figured it out from the physical realms. So I'm just trying to give a context about the synergy of science and Torah and where that may come from. But it's not just Torah. There are many faith principles and many ideas that are essential really to world religion in general, or even spiritual things that are not of a strictly religious nature. Let me give an example of how these things are relevant in science. A number of years back, the International Conference of Neuroscience in Washington was launched with a keynote speaker that was a little bit out of the norm. The Dalai Lama was invited to open the International Neuroscience Conference. We're talking about 3,000 neuroscientists all from all around the world, a gigantic thing. And when it was announced who would be one of the keynote speakers, hundreds of neuroscientists withdrew, said, we're not coming, this is ridiculous. But then hundreds more joined in to fill their ranks, going, wow, this could be really cool, this might be very important. Now, what was under discussion then was meditating monks getting into brainwave synchrony, and then one of them being isolated in a Faraday cage with, a lead and concrete lined box, which would prevent any electromagnetic radiation from getting in or out. But since they were both still meditating, their brain waves were still in synchrony, and then they would go and shine a light in the eye of one and watch the brain of the other react. And so the question was, what is transferring the information from one brain to another brain? How are they connected? If it's not through electromagnetic radiation, if there's no physical connection, no wave, no particle going from here to there, what is it that's doing the connection? Why is this relevant in neuroscience? Why is it relevant in science in general? Who cares? Because consciousness is important for reality to exist, and that's actually physics. And watching the physics of consciousness play out between people and in society is it's a brand new model, and they're exploring this. Where does that come from? What kind of a science is it that allows for consciousness to create reality or co-create reality? And what is that space between? How is that communication mediated? One of the I only brought books that I was privileged to participate in, but there's a book called The Conscious Universe by Springer Verlag textbook. That publishing company doesn't exist anymore, but it was the #1 scientific publisher in the world. If you got a couple of books there, it's like, forget it, your career is made. So that book talks about conclusions of modern physics. Let me just give you like an example, a couple of example phrases. The ultimate ground of reality is an indivisible wholeness beyond space and time, which is conscious and interacts with human consciousness to bring physical reality from potential to actual state at all times and places. Can I give that to you one more time? The ultimate ground of reality is an indivisible wholeness beyond space and time, which is conscious and interacts with human consciousness to bring physical reality from potential to actual. In other words, no people, no world. The way John Wheeler, the great physicist, colleague of Einstein, junior colleague of Einstein, but they studied together in Berlin. He was together with Bohr and Einstein. Anyway, he tested these outcomes of quantum physics, and the way he put it, the universe requires us as much as we require nature and its laws. there is an interdependency. How can that be? The science I grew up with was, we're just flotsam in the universe. We're just like nothing. We're an accidental hiccup. Life is meaningless. We're just dust on the scales. We're nothing whatsoever. It's a gigantic universe. There must be billions of planets with life like ours, and it's just a series of accidents that allows us to be. Our thoughts and our emotions are only imaginary. It's just, hormones. We're a bag of chemicals. That's all we are. We came from dust, we return to dust, and that's all there is. No meaning, no soul, no God. That was the science I grew up with. That science has changed. All of those underpinnings of science are no longer valid. Logical positivism. That's the idea that any question must have a rational answer, or else it's a meaningless question. If you can't answer it rationally, it's just a dumb question. Science was built on that. Material realism. If it's not stuff, it don't exist. That was the science I grew up with. No longer valid. Causal determinism. A billiard ball universe. Show me all the particles and the forces acting on them, said Laplace, and I'll tell you everything that will happen until the end of time. I loved that quote. That was amazing. What a great thing to be a scientist. You'd be able to figure everything out that could ever happen. Just know more about the stuff and the forces and you'll know everything. That was the science I grew up in. It doesn't happen now. It's not acceptable according to science itself. It's been demoted to a myth, this idea. And there's a couple more. What happened? How did it happen? Why did science become that way? And by the way, and there are media offerings that are all based on this now. Like now it's like public knowledge, right? There's the Matrix and what the bleep do we know, and all kinds of things that are out there. Books, The Secret. It's all based on this consciousness creates reality, and people are significant, and you can make anything happen. It's very bizarre. Well, they say that the art of speaking is to stop speaking before they stop listening. So I was going to describe 3 experiments that actually led to those conclusions so that you too could actually understand how that came to be. But I thought maybe that would be just too painful. So we'll see if we get that in question period. So I'm going to bypass that for the moment, and I will sort of come around the bend towards the conclusion. Robert Jastrow, he was, maybe still is, the founder of the Goddard Institute and the Mount Wilson Observatory, a very, very big astrophysicist. He describes the coming together of science and fundamental principles of faith as a megatrend. And he says as follows: for the scientist, it turns out like a bad dream. We've scaled the mountains of ignorance, climbing higher and higher, until we almost get to the summit, and we're about, as scientists, to climb up and get to the peak. We see a band of theologians sitting there at the top of the mountain, smiling down at us. They've been sitting there for centuries. And we've just gotten there with our science. That science and faith convergence is a thing. There's a PDF you can get online, 50 Nobelists and other great scientists who believe in God, and you can see what they have to say. Science is not atheistic. Real science and real faith are in a beautiful synergy. But the question is, why was that shift? How did that shift happen? So it turns out there's another Kabbalistic prophecy. It's right in the Zohar, and it's framed in Hasidic thought that pegs 1840 as a time of a scientific revolution and a spiritual revolution in Torah thought. Chassidut and natural science and technology blossomed in the century from 1740 to 1840, with a big culmination around the years of 1840. That was pegged 1900 years ago by the Zohar as being an information and knowledge upwelling and downpour that would prepare the world for the time of Mashiach. It's tikkun. The tikkun olam is happening through Torah and science. Now, why science? Why do we need that? Why the technology? That could be a talk for another time, or a question or something. But just to validate the dates that the Zohar pegged is a fabulous little fun fact. Jonathan Huebner is a sort of like a sociologist focusing on science and technology. And he takes a look at the history of science and technology. There was a book that came out, 9 years ago, a big fat book, an encyclopedia of science and technology, 7,000 discoveries and inventions from 1450 through to 2005. So we're talking about 1455 to 2005, 550 years. He divides the history up into decades, and he takes a look at the rate of discovery, how many innovations per capita in the world, and he takes a look and he discovers that 1840 was the peak. Then he looks at the number of U.S. patents per million population along the same period. Of course, just it had to be from the from 1776. But took a look at U.S. patents. 1840, boom, shot up like this, like a delta curve, like that. It was just, I don't think Jonathan Huebner ever till today studied Chassidus. He was looking from a completely different perspective. But when I saw 1840 on both graphs being the year for the explosion of knowledge and science and technology, I'm going, well, there's independent validation if you ever wanted to find it. Now, how that tikkun happens, that is another point, but I will close with another prophecy that's relevant to our times. It's not from the realm of science, because if science coming together with Torah is one facet of an emerging redemption, of the Jewish journey coming to a culmination, there's another one that has to do with issues that are happening in our day. Issues that are happening in our day. A war of evil against good. A war that evolves from the children of Yishmael. At the end of the Roman domination, which is Western civilization, there's another kick at the can, a big war, evil against good, and in the midst of that war, Mashiach comes and the world is saved. We can only hope for the best and hope for it immediately, but I want to share a story that happened to me on a subway in Toronto several years ago. My wife and I were actually on our way to a League of Human Rights dinner. Frank Diamond had put together 1,000 people in a room, 500 Gentiles, 500 Jews. It was a feel-good thing. Israel, Canada, world peace, work together. It was a nice event. We're on our way there, and standing right in front of me, we're seated. Somebody stands in front of me and holds up a book right in front of my face. Hezbollah, Party of God. There was plenty of room on the subway. There was standing room, but he could have stood anywhere. He decided to stand in front of me, about 18 inches from my face. I thought it was a handful of pamphlets because the spine had crumbled. But I looked closer and I saw, no, it was a book. And the corners were all brown and gray and dog-eared and rounded. It was like it was the only book this guy had ever read. And he's cradling it. And he's standing right in front of me. And I look up at him, I see this fellow, and I think, I'm here to say something. What do I say? I say, it's one God for the whole world, right? The guy goes, Yeah. I say, he wants goodness and kindness, right? He's like, yeah. I go, let's shake on it. He goes, I cannot do that. I say, only what we agree on. God, goodness, and kindness, nothing else. He says, I got to think about it. And he walks away. And I'm looking at him, and I see he's wearing a jacket, and I'm going, is it bulging? Is this going to be Madrid? Did I agitate him? My heart's going like thump, 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 and I just can't put it back in my chest. A few minutes later, he comes back, he says, I thought about it. Okay. I put out my hand. He takes my hand. We're like holding hands, like it's not like a business handshake, He's like 5 seconds. It's a long time. And before he gets off the subway, he comes back one more time. He says, good evening, ma'am. Good evening, sir. And he disappears. What happened over there? In that moment, what came to me was, what would the Lubavitcher Rebbe want me to say? Where am I going to find common ground? His last major message to the world media was, Mashiach is coming now. It's only for us to do more goodness and kindness. Well, I couldn't say Mashiach, because if I'll say Mashiach, he'll say Muhammad, and then we're going to get into a fight. But God, I knew we believed in. So we can start with God. That's our common ground. Goodness and kindness, that should be common ground. And it managed to do something. When we don't know what to do, we should look at what this Torah said. We were sitting here in the Chabad Romano Center. We spoke about great physicists. John Wheeler, who I mentioned before, I had a correspondence with him. I sent him a Tanya. He sent me a whole article showing his sensitivity and interest in this whole Hasidus thing and in Torah, and just amazing involvement that this physicist has probing Torah for answers to cosmological questions. That same Tanya that he was so grateful for, you could get a class from Rabbi Bernstein. Probably, there must be like a weekly Tanya class. I didn't even ask him. If there isn't one, there will be soon. You just ask him. The answers, I sent him that Tanya because the answers to the fundamental questions that he was asking in mass media are right there. And he knows it. We should know it too. When we make a bracha, you're going to have something to drink soon. I guess there's some drinks over there. Sha'akol niya bidbaro, that everything comes into existence through God's word. John Wheeler sent me an article, his last major work. We're talking about a guy who's got 4 Nobel physicists as his students. For his 90th birthday, they made an international physics conference, published a book. That was the gift to him. We're talking about a super player over here. So his last major paper was called It from Bit. He was trying to explain, how does this indivisible wholeness result in a reality? He was spending 6 months of a year traveling around the world, supervising research, and another 6 months of the year in an island off the coast of Maine thinking about being in nothingness. And he came up with this idea that the indivisible wholeness relates to a physical world through information space. And it's the information that is sourced in that indivisible wholeness, what they call the field. And then reality emerges from the information, and that's how there can be a world of many emerging from an ultimate one. It from bit. Shakol niya bidbaro. Hamachadesh betuvo b'chol yom tamid ma'aser v'reishis. Our prayers are filled with these concepts. We don't have to go far. Torah, Hasidus, davening. These are ultra-modern realities. Do you know what the Journal of Chinese Medicine has to say about tefillin? You can encourage your husbands to put on tefillin. That okay, I'll close with this one. A chiropractor by the name of Stephen Schramm, must be a Jewish boy. In 2002, he did a study. He took all the acupuncture points, acupressure points that the tefillin touch, the tefillin of the arm and the tefillin of the head touch, and he wrote them out as a script. Didn't talk about tefillin at all. Just listed the points. Presented them to 5 traditional practitioners of Chinese medicine and asked them, is this a prescription for something, and if so, what? And all 5 of them answered the same thing. Mental clarity and spiritual wellness. Can you imagine how great women are, that they already have innately that degree of mental clarity and spiritual wellness, that they don't need tefillin to achieve it? It's probably because of the corpus callosum, which connects the left and right hemispheres. Because the social emotional side on the right side is connected to the language logical side, and so women understand about feelings and relationships and can talk about it and explain it, and men are like, they have their feelings and they have their logic, and they just like, no, it doesn't work like that. We need the tefillin. Anyway, all this emerges, comes together, and it's there to teach us something that the ultimate treasure is right in our backyard, and we should all enjoy it. And in this way, we'll have a peaceful, happy way to welcome Mashiach. It should be speedily.
Excellent.
Any questions?
Are those acupuncture points same on the left and right hands?
Are the acupunctural points same on the left and right hands? I do not know the answer to that, but you can go Stephen Schramm, 2002. Journal of Chinese Medicine, that PDF will pop up, and I guarantee you nothing else is going to compete with it on the page. So you could report back to your fellows in Shul if left and right arms have the same points. That was the question. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on process theology and how it ties into your presentation.
Do I have any thoughts on process theology and how it ties into my presentation? I've never studied process theology. So I'm sorry that I don't yet have any thoughts on it. I've got some curiosity that could be. Do you want to take a moment and define process theology in 25 words or less?
I don't know if I can define it in 25 words or less, but essentially there are theologians in every major Abrahamic religion who have studied the idea of, and I guess Teilhard de Chardin would be one of the most well-known proponents, who have looked at some evolutionary ideas as suggesting the omega point is probably the most well-known concept of Teilhard de Chardin. The idea that, in fact, evolution is in the spiritual realm as well as the physical realm, and it is, in fact, a continuum, suggesting that kind of convergence in theology and science that you've been speaking about.
Thank you. That's a great comment. That's actually a comment, and it's a manifestation of it's common ground. I don't think I've gone anywhere and not found common ground in any thinkers in this area. I mean, you get boneheads like what's his name? The, so to speak, evolutionist.
Richard Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins.
Yeah,
he doesn't really publish much in evolution. He's not really that much of a scientist, but he's a great atheist.
Yeah, he's a great.
I mean, he just embraces atheism so wholeheartedly, and he just claims that science lines up with it. But if you really go to the thinkers in these areas, people who are actually publishing, the greater they are, the more likely they are converging to unity of their thought. Yes, sir.
What's interesting, and I just read 2 books on this subject that was recommended by Rabbi Errol Wine in history. He said, go read these 2 books, and it's talking about the Torah and science convergence. One of the things that the second book I read about, it talks about the classical observer. Like in the case of physics, right, in the quantum mechanics, in the double slit experiment, you literally have to be watching it, and it knows you're watching it, it changes it. So I mean, in the Big Bang Theory, you have before creation or before the start, you have what's called a vacuum. And in the vacuum, it's not really a vacuum. There's things coming in and out of creation instantly, and you see it in the particle accelerator.
Yeah, vacuum fluctuations.
Yeah, and then you have a false vacuum, right?
Yeah.
But the false vacuum can only happen if you have a classical observer.
Right.
Who's the classical observer? God. And they in the particle accelerator, they just from the Bison particle, right? What they call the God particle, right?
Right.
When they smash the particles together, the other particles that make the trajectories have to exist, but they don't exist.
Right.
But they do exist.
Right.
And they prove this. This is a proven fact. It exists, but it doesn't. Do you see what I mean?
Yes,
And
I actually do. There is a lot. That was actually a volume of information in point form. Yeah. So if you can get this gentleman to slow down, he can probably explain to you incredible things.
Well, it's really
But,
cool. I read a whole bunch
hang
of
on. We'll come to this. We should probably sit down at a Kiddush
I
one day
would
and
love to
explore.
do that.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to mention that if you know that the Arabs, they translated the Talmud and the Mishnah, and they finished the translation about a year ago, 2 years ago. And what they are doing is actually they are learning it, and they are taking the good things from the Torah, they put it to them, and the bad thing, they want to use it against the Judaism.
Surprise.
Something else I wanted, and by the way, this is why they declare today, I don't know if you know, because they are the real Jewish, because they want to take the West Bank, the holy places, and Jerusalem. When they have Jerusalem also as a capital, here we are the Jewish. By the way, this is what they tell themselves, they are the Jewish. It could be because they say they become Muslims after that. Anyway, I wanted to ask you, what about, I have few points that you mentioned. First of all, the scientists, they believe that there are other lives in the universe. There are many more by statistics. This is one.
There are many more what?
Life.
Right.
In other planets on the universe, because the universe is so big, so statistically it could be possible. I would like to hear your answer about this. And the second thing is the Torah. Means there are two parts. One God, and here is abstract and we create the matter and the physical laws. And the second thing is the Torah. Is the God wrote the Torah or not? The God didn't wrote the Torah. Means if it is acceptable. So, third other point is that most of the people, they take the God, they give a frame for the God.
They give what?
The God. They build a frame to the God. The God has to do this, that. Then they say, oh, he didn't do that, so he does not exist. So this is the mistake of most of the people, that they say the God does not exist because they put the frame, and for example, there was a Holocaust. So they said, if there is a God, how come there are Holocaust? Means they put a frame that if there is a God, Holocaust shouldn't happen. And if the Holocaust happened, means there is no God. And not only that, there are many things that the people, they put the frame, and then they break the frame and they say God does not exist.
Okay.
And, okay, now other things, I have few points, I just wanted to mention also that when...
One second, it's not a question, right? It's a speech.
Questions answered. There are few points and the
I've got a few questions out of the speech.
together, there are many things. And for example, when the Jewish they say God, Muslims they say God, and the Christians they say God, they use the same words, not only for God, for other things, Messiah, okay? But everybody means two different things. So we cannot use the God for Judaism the same like Muslims. The Arabs, the Muslims, they use the God, but he has a vice president, Muhammad. In Christianity, the God is three. So it is different. Messiah also for Jewish, Christian, and Judaism. Everybody means to the same different thing. And this is made a mistake when people they use. When I am talking, for example, with the one is non-Jew. When I talk Messiah, it is different meaning, and this is a mistake. So we have to take it in account. And what I learned also, there is no difference between the evolution is not against the Torah, because what the evolution is says that, for example, the elephant has a short nose and then becomes long. But this is by using the nature. What do you mean nature? Physical nature, right? Physical nature. Physical nature, the God created the physics. These are the Jewish, the God's law, so there is no contract against each other. I have only also many points other about, it is very interesting about Judaism and science. This is what I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Your camera is pointing the wrong way.
Thank very briefly, I have an article for you to read. I referred to it already regarding intelligent life in the universe, and I think you'll enjoy it. I'll leave this over here for you specifically. I definitely agree that people, well, here's the point. The God of the Torah is an abstract, undefinable God. It just so happens that in Revelation, he showed his will and wisdom through the Torah. That was a choice that he made. In fact, the decision was made as soon as he decided to create a world and with nature and its laws, that should be the context through which he would be expressed later as a lawgiver for man. Those two gods, the one that has a personality through nature and its laws, and one that has another personality by being above it and by caring about individuals, which is not what nature looks like. It's one and the same God that is, in fact, abstract, infinite, undefinable, and unknowable. And yet, through nature we can know some things. Through Torah, we can know whatever it is that we can know through nature and much more. So both of them are aspects, perspectives. And we're coming to Purim, and I know that there's going to be an event. It's coming right around the corner, right? Wednesday, March 4th. Purim is the classic time where the mask of nature becomes the vehicle to express divine will through the Torah. And God gets his way without us even knowing, because we're supposed to have free choice. So I wanted to share that. It was a statement and a question. This was an answer, and with a speech, we're speeching at each other. But hopefully we're also communicating. And regarding relating to non-Jews, regarding the Messiah and the Mashiach, maybe on another occasion we'll over a kiddush or something, we could talk about some experiences that we've had doing that. You'd be surprised how you could find common ground. I believe you could find common ground with pretty much anybody, unless they have a loaded weapon aimed at you. Yeah, but yeah, for anybody, if you're ready to talk, if people are ready to talk, you can pretty much find the common ground. Anybody who didn't speak yet? Yes?
I have two very little things. When you mentioned a person named Ilya Prigozhin, is there a chance that he can be Ilya Prigozhin?
Prigozhin?
Ilya Prigozhin.
Probably yes. My pronunciation is... The question is the one I called Ilya Prigozhin, could it be Ilya Prigozhin? And I suspect if he's a physical chemist of international stature, it's probably one and the same person.
And the other thing is that I understood that the Big Bang Theory actually represents the fact of creating a world, of creating world from nothing. And you were saying that Big Bang Theory is not a theory that is now the actual.
The only view. It's challenged, correct.
And in my mind, it was representing this idea of creating the world from nothing. Is that right?
Okay, so the question is, the Big Bang Theory represents the idea that something is created from nothing. It was, my brackets, an example of science saying something the Torah says, and therefore it's good. If you're going to take away from us the Big Bang because you say scientists are challenging it, what happens to creation? So the answer to that is, we believe in creation Because the Torah says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. If scientific theory embraces that idea in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, that's wonderful. If it drops it, or it comes back to it, that's science's prerogative. Because science is looking at nature, trying to understand God from nature, and from observations. We have an insight from another place. So our belief isn't predicated on what the cosmologists tell us.
If there is another cosmologist theory that can make this idea of making something out of nothing like the same.
Yes. Is there another cosmological theory that gives us something from nothing?
Yes.
I would say that quantum physics gives us something from nothing, not only from an origin in time in the foggy past, but as a continuous creation here and now. So that all of reality is emerging like this. I'll give you an example. You look at a television screen. I don't have a television, but I do have a computer. But yes, anyway, something which is presenting a static image. Imagine you're watching a TV, there's a tree. And the tree is just sitting there. Maybe its leaves are blowing in the wind or something like this. But it's just a static, stationary image, basically. How is that image? Is it really a picture, like a photograph that just sits there? It's really scanning electrons that are zipping across the screen 30 or 60 times a second with a certain frequency and recreating that image from nothing to something. There's a hidden code, the information content of that image, and then there's electrical energy, and then there's some processors, and the energy in the processors are imposing the code on the electrons, forming them into this recreated image. And you see it as something that's happening. The same thing is happening in the physical reality. We're looking at each other. You're not a static, you're a dynamic. You're emerging from a nothing to a something now. And that's the fact of the physics of reality everywhere in the world right now. Those vacuum fluctuations that this young man was speaking about are the processes that inform the physical reality as it happens. And we have some interaction with it. We help to recreate each other as well. It's interesting how it works and what it can achieve. Anybody heard of the idea, tracht gut, wird sein gut? Think positive, you will get a positive outcome? Some people heard about it. There's some reality to that.
I always thought that this is a wishful thinking.
Wishful thinking. And I also always thought it was wishful thinking. That there were two types of people. Optimists and realists. Now I realize there are two types of people. Pessimists and realists. But really, we have a lot more power than we realize. We would like it to be. Well, this will also be another discussion for another time. Yeah. I empathize. I absolutely empathize. Sir.
Here's a tough question. Is there any theory or belief system that has been conclusively proven?
Is there any theory or belief system that has been conclusively proven?
And if so, how do you know that you have one?
And if so, how do you know?
How do you know that you've got one?
And how do you know that you have one? Oh, you would like to answer?
He said he said theory. When you say theory, means you cannot, it is not 100%. Means you can, today you show it is right, after a few years it will change. That's why even the atom is theory. Everything is theory because today we believe, the theory will be changed maybe a few years later, so we don't know. So as long as that's why we use the word theory, means no guarantee that it is 100%.
Right. Now, it's a very good point, excellent point and excellent answer, which I agree with entirely. I'd like to add something to that. The word conclusively injects another point, which is there enough information to decide and act? That's the idea of conclusive proof. That means to draw the conclusion is something that we will to do. If I really have a 50-50 proposition, I don't decide. I can decide randomly. That's not really a decision. Is there a weight of evidence that is compelling in some areas? And if we translate that into a theoretical structure, can there be a weight of evidence that will guide us to say, yes, this theory is right? Even though ultimately it could be changed for another theory later.
Yes, it is like the physics on the Earth is different than the physics in the universe, and the difference than the physics in the microwave, the atom. Means you cannot use the same formulas of the everyday life on our Earth for the atom, and you cannot use it for the universe. It is different. Now, you can say, how come that there is a mass for universe, mass of the Earth, mass for the micro, for the atoms? So it has to be something connected between them. This is what Einstein also believed. It means we don't know till now. It means you cannot say there was empty between them.
Yeah.
That's why
let's put it this way. Is the sun going to rise tomorrow?
Yeah.
So?
Yeah. Yeah.
We can decide our actions based on that assumption. That's fair.
So would it be conclusive proof that the sun will rise tomorrow, that it rose the previous days?
Nope.
So we have no, so given that we can't, because we can always construct a scenario where there will be failure based, if you predict based on the past. For example, lemmings. I've been running in this direction for like 4 days. This is going to be, it's a no-brainer. We're going to be okay. We're just running. We're going to be okay. We eat, we run, we eat, we run. It's fine. Don't worry. And then you get to the cliff and then boom. You don't know the future based on the past. That's not a proof. So it's not a conclusive proof. Now, there are better proofs than that, more compelling proofs than that. For example, causal reasoning. Now, we said causal determinism isn't ultimately true in physics. I agree that this is what we said it. But we tend to believe, and we use it as a basis of action, that anything that exists has a reason or a prior condition that has led it to be so. So nothing sort of is purely random. Even if there's randomness, there's some cause of this random type of behavior. And if you study the laws deeper, you'll find out what's making random behavior go. This type of thing. So we believe in cause and effect. If you just take cause and effect reasoning, and you assume also, that perception gives an indication of reality, and you just say, our data is the perceptions. Our cause and effect reasonings are going to lead us to conclusions that can be validated in different ways. And that's how science works. You will come with just that to more than one conclusive proof that God exists, and that the Torah was given at Sinai, and that the mitzvahs that we do today are God's will revealed then. So, a sufficient conclusive proof like any other scientific or empirical reality, yes. Absolute conclusive proof philosophically, I don't think it exists.
May I add one point? Even we say that the one that...
Just one second. Do you get an answer?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay.
Even the one that says that there is no God, he believes, he thinks, means he cannot prove it. It is like 50% of the cup is water, 50% empty.
Right.
It is also religion.
Yeah.
I mean, when he say deism.
I would like to dedicate my next comment in answer to that also to this young lady here. There's a book called Faith After the Holocaust by a rabbi, I think it's David Berkowitz. Anybody seen this book, Faith After the Holocaust? He has a very interesting statement there. He says, the disbelief of the survivor is more holy than the faith of the Orthodox. Very interesting statement. What does he base that on? The survivor saw injustice. But if God exists, he must be just. And since there is injustice, she or he has two options. Either God is unjust, or he doesn't exist. Rather than say that God exists but is unjust, to protect the concept of divine justice, they wish him away. And for that reason, they put their disbelief on a higher level than the faith of the Orthodox.
Wow.
Life is complex and very, very challenging. Yeah, many ideas along these lines. Yeah. Anyways, to end on a more positive note, somebody have a positive note? I think that was a bit heavy. That was a bit heavy as a bad way to end. Yes, sir.
I have read that there is no conflict between the Torah and creation, in that the Big Bang is just a way of explaining that God created the world.
Yes.
And also there is no conflict between the 13 billion years and the days of creation.
Yes.
Can you comment? Is it true? Or?
Right. There's no conflict between the 6 days and the 13 billion years. And what was the first point? That the creation.
The Big Bang is just an explanation.
The Big Bang is just an explanation of creation.
Yes.
Correct.
Same page.
Yeah, same. Okay.
Thank you so much.